Tonight, we're diving into one of the greatest survival innovations in human history. How Native Americans built teepees that remained warm, comfortable, and livable in temperatures so brutally cold they would reduce most modern people to panic over a mere 3-degree dip on the thermostat. If you're enjoying this, please consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if it genuinely resonates with you. And if you feel inclined, drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you are and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see who's tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you picture a dwelling built to endure winters at -30, the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes question their very existence, you might imagine something heavy, fortified, and aggressively unwelcoming. Thick stone walls, tiny windows, and a fireplace so large it practically qualifies as a roommate. Essentially, a medieval castle minus the castle. Yet the people who not only survived but thrived in that frigid environment weren't holed up in stone cubes. They lived in teepees, elegant, aerodynamic structures that appear deceptively simple from afar, but are, in reality, smarter than half the buildings we construct today. And let's be honest, teepees don't get nearly enough credit. If Europeans had invented them, there would be operas composed in their honor, oil paintings titled Ode to the Perfect Cone, an entire architectural curricula devoted to the sacred geometry of portable warmth. But because this brilliance emerged from indigenous peoples, too many history books dismiss it with a shrug, a kind of tent that's like calling a NASA spacecraft a metal canoe with ambition. From the outside, a teepee looks clean and minimalist, the sort of design that would appear on Pinterest, but every inch of it exists because generations of people paid close attention to the land, learning precisely how wind, snow, and temperature behaved, not guessing, but observing, adapting, and refining over centuries. Meanwhile, early European settlers were constructing cramped square cabins that trapped smoke inside as if they were trying to hotbox themselves into the afterlife. What's truly astonishing is how perfectly the teepee works with the environment rather than against it. It doesn't resist the wind, it slices through it. It doesn't try to bear the weight of snow, it sheds it effortlessly, like a buffalo shaking off a bad mood. Modern houses panic at the sight of a single snowflake, fretting over roof damage. The teepee's response: cute, try harder. That's architectural confidence. Here's my personal opinion. The teepee might be one of the smartest human inventions ever created. Portable, insulated, ventilated, warm in winter, cool in summer, easy to repair, and easy to move. Its list of virtues outshines even the most praised pieces of modern design. IKEA furniture comes with an instruction manual that reads like a ransom note. The teepee, it was more than shelter, it was a survival machine, perfectly adapted, perfectly efficient, and perfectly suited to a world that daily tried to freeze its inhabitants into decorative ice sculptures. And that's how people inside a teepee stayed alive while winter outside screamed like it was auditioning for a horror film. Before a teepee could become the warm, elegant winter fortress it was, it needed a skeleton, not the spooky Halloween kind, but a sturdy framework. This began with poles, long, straight, strong, and lightweight. Fortunately, the Great Plains offered the perfect tree for the job: lodgepole pine. a species so ideally suited to teepee construction that it seems nature was showing off. These poles were tall, slim, surprisingly durable, the supermodels of the arboreal world. Anyone who's ever wrestled a heavy timber across uneven terrain knows that lightweight and durable rarely go hand in hand. But lodgepole pines made it look effortless. Selecting poles wasn't a matter of wandering into the woods and pointing at the nearest tree. It was a deliberate, informed process based on deep ecological knowledge. People understood exactly which trees worked and which didn't, a level of material discernment that humbles modern sensibilities. Most of us struggle to choose a ripe avocado without existential dread. Yet these communities selected structural components with near mathematical precision. Once harvested, the poles were arranged into a tripod, the foundation of the teepee. This wasn't experimental or makeshift, it was rock solid, capable of withstanding prairie winds fierce enough to knock the personality out of a buffalo. After the tripod was secured, the remaining poles were added in a precise spiral pattern. This wasn't just for aesthetic appeal, though it is beautiful. The spiral distributed weight evenly, allowed snow to glide off gracefully, and created a cage-like framework strong enough to resist powerful gusts. Modern stadiums boast about similar engineering, except the teepee achieved it first, without steel, computers, or six-figure consulting fees. Here's something rarely acknowledged. Lodgepole pine poles were reused for years, even decades. They traveled with families from camp to camp, season to season, across hunting grounds and ceremonial sites. Imagine a house whose structural elements remain intact and functional over years of relocation. It's a dream most modern flatpack furniture owners can only fantasize about. In short, the lodgepole pine wasn't just a it was the backbone of the plains home, a perfect architectural gift from the environment. And honestly, today's builders could learn a great deal from it. The teepee's conical shape may look simple, almost too simple, but that's where its genius lies. It's the kind of brilliance that hides behind effortless elegance. You glance at it and think, oh, a nice triangle. Then winter arrives, temperatures plummet to -30, and the wind howls across the plains like it's running late for a demonic appointment. Suddenly, that triangle is performing miracles. First, the cone is inherently aerodynamic. A teepee doesn't fight the wind, doesn't argue or resist like a stubborn European rectangle. It simply leans back and says, "Do your worst," while the wind slides up and over it like it's been emotionally dismissed. If early colonists had arrived with less architectural ego and more curiosity, they might have looked at the teepee and said, "That's how you avoid freezing to death." Instead, they built leaky, smoky boxes that lost heat as if trying to cool the entire continent. The cone also excels at shedding snow, rather than accumulating weight on the roof. Snow slides right off, preventing collapse and eliminating the need for dangerous rooftop shoveling in blizzard conditions. Inside, the shape promotes even heat distribution. Warm air rises naturally through the center, then circulates downward along the walls, eliminating cold corners and kidney-stabbing drafts. Most modern apartments can't claim the same comfort. Structurally, the cone channel stressed downward through the poles into the ground. This is why teepees bend, flex, and endure, then snap under pressure. A building doesn't need to defeat nature, it needs to cooperate with it. That's a lesson humanity often overlooks. If this cone had been invented in Europe, architects would still be erecting statues in its honor. There'd be parades, national holidays, and TED Talks titled The Divine Geometry of the Cone. But indigenous nations perfected it quietly, efficiently, and beautifully, not for praise, but for survival. And the cone delivered. Once the wooden skeleton stood firm against the plains wind, looking like the world's most formidable tripod, it was time to clothe it. Not with flimsy canvas or hope this holds fabric, but with buffalo hides. One of nature's greatest insulating inventions, arguably superior to half the premium outdoor gear sold today at outrageous markups. Buffalo hides weren't chosen out of convenience. They were chosen because they were perfect. A buffalo is essentially a walking furnace wrapped in muscle and fur, surviving winters so severe even the snow considered relocating. If an animal can treat -30 like a mild autumn morning, its hide is exactly what you want, wrapping your home. Sewing these hides together was no amateur task. It was a refined art form requiring skill, patience, and techniques perfected over generations. The hides were softened, shaped, and stitched using sinew-natural thread so strong and flexible it outperforms most modern synthetics. I believe today's sewing machines would weep in envy if they saw what sinew could accomplish. You could lasso a small car with that stuff. Once assembled, the covering formed a single, massive Sheeta winter cloak, so effective it could shame a medieval king's finest mantle. Draping it over the frame followed a specific sequence, aligning seams so wind flowed over them, not through. Europeans, meanwhile, assumed survival required thick logs, brick, and prayer. Indigenous nations were crafting aerodynamic, insulated, weatherproof masterpieces with hides and deep ecological knowledge. Even better, the hide covering was adaptable. In winter, extra layers could be added for insulation. In summer, sections could be rolled up for ventilation. Contrast that with European settlers who spent winters alternately freezing or choking on smoke, mystified by why comfort eluded them. Spoiler, it was poor design. And here's a personal opinion. The buffalo hide covering might be the most elegant example of using the land without exploiting it. The hides were a gift used with respect, wisdom, and gratitude, not as an infinite resource to plunder, but as a sacred material to honor. The final result: a teepee wrapped so intelligently and tightly that even roaring. If you've ever seen a buffalo up close, two truths become obvious immediately. One, it's enormous, and two, it's dressed for winter, like it's preparing to duel the Ice Age itself. Buffalo hides aren't just warm, they're absurdly warm, unfairly warm, the kind of warm that makes you question why modern Arctic-grade jackets cost hundreds, yet perform so poorly. I've worn gear marketed as windproof and thermal, yet a buffalo standing in a January blizzard looks infinitely more comfortable than I do walking to my mailbox. That's precisely why these hides formed the teepee's winter armor. A buffalo lives its entire life outdoors, shrugging off temperatures that send humans into full survival mode, -30. That's just Tuesday. Its fur is dense, its hide thick, and its insulation so efficient that snow falling on its back doesn't even melt, proof of extraordinary heat retention. That's not just biology, it's a flex. Imagine stitching multiple such hides into one seamless, weatherproof envelope. It's like wrapping your entire home in North America's ultimate polar survival suit. And unlike modern brands, hawking ultralight, breathable, revolutionary tech, the buffalo hide simply said, "I will keep you alive. You're welcome." Nothing on a buffalo went to waste. Meat, bones, sinew, fat, hooves all had purpose. The hides were treated, tanned, and prepared using knowledge honed over hundreds of generations. While many today struggle to assemble a basic bookshelf, these communities transformed massive animal skins into airtight, winter-ready insulation. On the open plains, winter wind doesn't blow, it attacks. It hunts for gaps, cracks, weaknesses. A buffalo hide responded like a seasoned bouncer. No entry, move along, and beyond warmth, the hide kept moisture out. Snow slid off, rain beaded and rolled away. This wasn't primitive, it was highly refined environmental engineering. If buffalo hide insulation were sold today, it would be labeled artisan, eco-luxury, thermal shielding, cost a fortune, and sell out instantly to people who claim to love nature but flinch at the sight of a spider. The teepee didn't just use buffalo hides, it maximized their full potential. If the buffalo hide exterior was the teepee's heavy winter coat, then the inner lining was the hidden engineering marvel most never notice. At first glance, it appears to be just another layer of hide or cloth hanging inside. But in truth, this lining elevated the teepee from very good to how is this cozier than a colonial cabin built by a dozen axe-wielding men. The lining created a double-wall insulation system, intentional, refined over generations. The outer hide blocked wind, snow, and weather. The inner lining, suspended several inches inward, trapped a pocket of still air between the layers, functioning just like modern home insulation, but without fiberglass, foam, or crippling repair bills. When the central fire burned, warm air rose and flowed upward between the lining and outer cover, circulating in a controlled loop. Instead of escaping or pooling uselessly at the top, heat was guided downward along the interior walls, maintaining consistent, comfortable temperatures. Even in brutal cold, the living space stayed warm. The lining also managed smoke brilliantly, rather than drifting sideways and filling the space like a 19th century consumption ward. Smoke was funneled upward toward the smoke hole, where adjustable flaps vented it out. Fresh air entered from the bottom edge, warmed as it rose, and pushed smoke out while retaining heat. This system also blocked ground-level drafts, a chronic flaw in European-style dwellings. Cold air couldn't sweep across the floor. The lining gently redirected it upward into the warm convection current. With hides and mats on the floor, the effect was surprisingly cozy. Best of all, the lining was adaptable, lowered fully in winter for maximum heat retention, raised in summer for airflow. Everything was responsive, efficient, and designed to work with nature, not against it. No wasted materials, no battle with the elements, just intelligent, integrated design. At the very top of every teepee sat one of its most underappreciated features, the smoke flaps. To the untrained eye, they might seem decorative to triangular hides fluttering in the breeze. But to anyone who's ever tried to manage indoor fire in winter, these flaps were nothing short of heroic. They functioned as the teepee's climate control system centuries before thermostats, chimneys, or smart home gadgets. When the central fire burned small, steady, and well managed, it produced smoke that that naturally rose without ventilation. The interior would become unbearable, but the flaps directed smoke upward and out, acting like an adjustable chimney. Using two long poles, occupants could open, close, or angle the flaps based on wind direction. If the wind shifted, as it often did on the plains, with the drama of a slammed door, the flaps could be repositioned in seconds to maintain efficient airflow. This allowed fresh air to enter from below, while warm air circulated and smoke exited. No complex mechanics, just poles and wisdom. Meanwhile, European chimneys frequently clogged, smoked back, or collapsed under snow because they ignored local conditions. The flaps also regulated temperature, open wide to cool in summer, narrowed to retain heat in winter. At -30, precise adjustments kept interiors warm without suffocation. Their placement at the cone's peak was deliberate. Trising warm air created a natural draft that pulled smoke upward, with the flaps acting as directional vents. The result? Clean air, retained heat, no towering chimney required. In short, the smoke flaps transformed the teepee's apex from a simple opening into a dynamic, low-tech masterpiece of environmental controls, so intelligent that modern architects still study it with admiration and maybe a touch of envy. At the heart of every teepee literally and symbolically burned a small, steady fire. Not a roaring bonfire, not a cinematic inferno, but a carefully controlled hearth that provided warmth, light, and cooking without filling the space with smoke or risk. This central fire was the quiet workhorse of teepee life, doing everything a European fireplace did, but with far fewer complaints. Its placement in the exact center ensured even heat distribution, efficient smoke movement, and safe distance from flammable walls. The cone's geometry allowed heat to rise straight up, gather beneath the smoke hole, and flow through the channels created by the inner lining. A modest flame was all that was needed. The teepee's design did the heavy thermal lifting, proving that efficiency beats brute force, a lesson modern heating systems would do well to relearn. The hearth was multifunctional, light at night, heat for cooking, warmth for sleep. Pots hung above it, food roasted beside it. Wet clothing could be dried, an essential function in a climate where dampness meant danger. Yet the fire remained contained. Smoke escaped cleanly through the flaps, and the lining directed airflow upward, preventing coughing fits or stinging eyes. Most impressively, the hearth harmonized with the teepee's shape. As warm air rose, it drew in fresh air from the bottom edge, creating a self-sustaining ventilation loop. No chimneys, no pipes, no icy rooftop repairs. It was easy to maintain, quick to adjust, and a perfect example of comfort through thoughtful design, not overwhelming power. Life inside a winter teepee wasn't just warm, it was organized, intentional, and remarkably comfortable. If you've ever lived in a modern apartment designed by someone who clearly dislikes humans, you'll appreciate how thoughtfully teepee interiors used space. Nothing was random. Every object served warmth, togetherness, or survival, ideally all three. Sleeping areas lined the perimeter, insulated from the cold ground by hides and furs. This ring of bedding provided personal space within an open floor plan, more efficient than most studio apartments today. At the center sat the hearth, the teepee's sun, the gravitational core of daily life. Families gathered there to cook, talk, craft, repair. and share stories often, while the wind outside sounded like it was filing a formal complaint. The circular layout encouraged eye contact and conversation, a social dynamic that modern open-concept homes endlessly chase but rarely achieve. And, crucially, the entire space felt equal. No cold corners, no dark, suspicious nooks, like in log cabins. Thanks to the convection between the inner and outer layers, warmth was evenly distributed. No one got stuck in the drafty zone Europeans reserved for their least favorite relatives. Hooks, poles, and lines along the walls allowed efficient storage of tools, clothing, and cooking gear. Drying racks could hang from the poles, warmed by rising heat. A teepee could seamlessly shift roles: living room, bedroom, kitchen, workshop, gathering hall, without ever feeling cramped. But the real magic was how the structure fostered connection. Warmth invited conversation. The circle encouraged participation. The open space welcomed rituals, storytelling, teaching, singing, and laughter, even as storms raged outside like furious opera singers. A winter teepee wasn't just shelter, it was a living, breathing community space where families didn't merely survive the cold, they lived fully within it. One of the teepee's most underrated achievements wasn't its aerodynamics, smoke control, or buffalo hide insulation. It was this: people inside weren't forced to sit, sleep, or walk on frozen ground like reluctant penguins. The floor itself was a system of insulation, comfort, and practical design, turning icy earth into something surprisingly warm and livable. At -30, that's nothing short of miraculous. The foundation was a layer of brush, grass, or woven mats, creating a buffer between the soil and living space. This first layer acted as a diplomat, preventing. On top came animal hides, buffalo robes, deer skins, adding warmth and softness, a stark upgrade over the hard, cold floors of European cabins. Even today, stepping onto a fur rug on a winter morning feels luxurious. In a teepee, it wasn't luxury, it was survival with style. These hides created an insulating layer, allowing heat from the central fire to radiate downward, keeping sleeping areas genuinely warm. The floor was also flexible. If more people arrived, weather shifted, or storage needs changed, hides could be rearranged, layered, or expanded. And there was a hygiene advantage. If snow or mud was tracked in, and someone always tracked something in, the hides could be lifted, shaken, cleaned, or dried near the fire. Try doing that with a colonial wooden floor spoiler. It doesn't go well altogether. The floor worked in harmony with the teepee's thermal design. Heat rose, insulation held, airflow circulated, everything protected the family from the brutal cold outside. So while the wind turned the plains into a frozen battlefield, those inside sat on warm ground, wrapped in comfort, proof once again that good design beats brute force every time. But here's the real plot twist. The most astonishing feature of the teepee wasn't how warm it stayed or how well it managed smoke. It was this: the entire structure was genuinely portable. Not technically portable like modern furniture that claims ease of assembly but delivers despair. The teepee was truly portable, easy to disassemble, quick to pack, simple to move, and fast to rebuild. Everything a European cabin was not. A practiced family could take down a teepee in under an hour. Poles unlashed, hide covering folded, lining packed, belongings bundled, no nails, no collapsing roofs, no heavy beams. The design acknowledged a fundamental truth Europeans often ignored. Humans move, animals migrate, seasons change, food sources shift. A home should adapt to life, not chain people to one spot. Once disassembled, components were loaded onto a travois, simple sled pulled by dogs or horses, and moved to the next site. The teepee wasn't just a building, it was a philosophy. Lightweight, responsive, resilient, it carried the past, sustained the present, and moved with the future. And that, more than insulation, geometry, or hide qualities, perhaps its greatest lesson, that the best shelter isn't the strongest fortress, but the one that moves with you, breathes with the land, and turns survival into something not just bearable, but beautiful. Sled-like frames, pulled by dogs in earlier times and later by horses, after their introduction, formed the backbone of plains mobility. The teepee poles themselves often doubled as the rails of this travois, yet another testament to how every element of the teepee served multiple purposes. Nothing was wasted, nothing was merely decorative. Everything had a function, honed by necessity and refined by generations. Meanwhile, European settlers were busy chopping down entire forests to build wooden houses they'd abandon a year later, often because they'd placed them in poorly chosen locations, with little regard for wind patterns, water access, or seasonal shifts. But what truly set the teepee apart wasn't just its portability, was how swiftly it could be rebuilt. The same family who took it down in under an hour could have it standing again by midday. Poles arranged, hide covering secured, inner lining hung, and a small hearth already casting its first warm glow. Imagine relocating your entire home in the time it takes most people today to assemble a single piece of flat-pack furniture, and without the accompanying existential crisis. For the peoples of the plains, mobility wasn't a luxury, it was essential to the rhythm of life. Hunting patterns, seasonal changes, water sources, and resource cycles all demanded movement. The teepee allowed families to follow the land without sacrificing comfort or warmth. There was no need to choose between shelter and adaptability. No one had to drag a wooden cabin across the prairie like an unwilling, splintering pet. The teepee solved the problem with elegance. Your home moved with you, not against you. This portability also strengthened community bonds. Camps could gather, expand, merge, or divide as needed. Families could join seasonal ceremonies, communal hunts, or social gatherings, confident their homes could be packed and ready at a moment's notice. In a landscape defined by vastness and unpredictability, the teepee's mobility wasn't convenience, it was survival made simple. If you've ever lived in a house with a poorly sealed front door, you know how a single draft can undo an entire heating system. Now imagine that draft at -30, with wind screaming sideways like it's personally offended by your very existence. The entrance of a winter teepee had to withstand exactly that, and it did so with a quiet, confident brilliance that modern architects would do well to study. The first line of defense was orientation. Teepees traditionally faced east, away from the prevailing western winds that swept across the plains with the subtlety of an enraged bear. This wasn't superstition, it was meteorology, practiced long before weather maps and animated forecasts. By facing east, the teepee minimized exposure to the harshest gusts, turning the doorway into a controlled threshold rather than a wind tunnel. Next came the door flap, a hide covering that acted as a flexible but highly effective barrier. It could be lifted, tied back, weighted down, doubled over, or layered, depending on the season. Unlike a rigid wooden door that fights the wind and risks structural stress, the flap moved with it, reducing resistance and preventing cold air from barging in uninvited. During severe storms, a second flap or extra insulation could be added behind the main one, creating a miniature airlock. This two-layer system trapped frigid air before it entered the living space, performing the same function as modern vestibules, but without power strips, space heaters, or passive-aggressive "please close both doors" signs. Inside, the teepee's inner lining also played a role. Though it didn't extend all the way to the entrance, its presence helped redirect any sneaking draft downward, where it was drawn into the teepee's natural convection system, transformed from an intruder into part of the airflow that kept the interior warm. Even the low height of the doorway was intentional. Yes, you had to stoop to enter, but given the choice between dignified posture and not freezing to death, warmth always won. The low entrance minimized warm air loss each time someone came or went altogether. The design turned what could have been a structural vulnerability into a functional strength. The entrance wasn't just an opening, it was an engineered barrier against winter's worst. In a climate where one bad draft could ruin a night's rest, the teepee door didn't just keep the cold out, it kept comfort in. Stepping inside a well-built winter teepee at -30 feels like walking into a plot twist. You brace for suffering, frozen eyelashes, bone-deep chill, the kind of cold that makes your skeleton draft a formal complaint. Instead, you're met with genuine warmth and a level of comfort that would leave many European settlers staring in stunned silence, followed by the quiet, humbling realization: we've been doing this all wrong. A winter teepee didn't just block the cold, it created a self-sustaining microclimate. Between the buffalo hide exterior, the insulated inner lining, the central hearth, and the carefully managed airflow, the interior could be so warm that people removed outer layers, worked with bare hands, and slept soundly, no shivering, no burrito-style wrapping required. This level of environmental control, achieved without metal stoves, electric heaters, or a woodpile the size of a village, remains one of the most impressive feats of indigenous engineering. Light came from the hearth and filtered softly through the hide walls, casting a warm amber glow, like choosing cozy mode on a smart bulb. Except the entire structure was the bulb. Shadows flickered gently along the interior, creating an atmosphere perfect for storytelling, teaching, crafting, or simply resting while the world outside tried to turn itself into an ice sculpture. Storage hung neatly from the pole's tools, bags, clothing, all kept off the floor. This added organization also preserved airflow along the walls, maintaining the convection system that made the teepee so effective. Nothing felt cluttered, nothing felt cramped. The space was shaped with intention, not the chaotic accumulation of objects fighting for territory, a description that, let's be honest, fits many modern living rooms. Sleeping areas formed a ring along the outer edge, layered with hides and furs. Thanks to the insulated floor system and heated air circulation, these spots stayed noticeably warmer than the central walkway. Families rested peacefully, wrapped in warmth, while blizzards roared outside with the enthusiasm of 1,000 disgruntled wolves. What might surprise modern observers most is how livable the space felt. This wasn't bare minimum survival. It was full, vibrant life. Cooking, mending clothes, carving tools, singing, sharing stories, teaching children, preparing food. Daily existence continued seamlessly, untouched by the howling cold beyond the hide walls. The winter teepee didn't just protect people from the environment, it created a refuge, a bubble of warmth, safety, and community in a world that demanded resilience. A home where life thrived, even as winter tried its absolute best to extinguish it. When European settlers first encountered winter teepees, their reaction mirrored that of someone realizing their expensive smartphone can't do something a decades old. Model handles with ease, confusion, denial, and eventually grudging respect. Up to that point, most Europeans assumed proper housing required heavy. Consider the average settler cabin, hastily built, poorly adapted to the local climate, with gaps between logs wide enough to serve as secondary entrances for wind. Roofs leaked, chimneys smoked back, floors froze solid, wind whistled through walls like a judgmental dinner guest. Each winter brought fresh revelations about architectural regret. Now compare that to a winter teepee. Aerodynamic, insulated, portable, breathable, warm, and structurally flexible. It didn't wrestle the wind, it redirected it. It didn't trap smoke until half the family coughed themselves to sleep. It vented cleanly through an adjustable system. It didn't collapse under snow, shrugged it off so effortlessly that even gravity seemed impressed. Even heating efficiency favored the teepee. A single small fire could warm the entire interior without wasting fuel. Meanwhile, settlers burned through wood piles large enough to double as fortifications, spending entire days chopping, stacking, and worrying about supply while teepee dwellers tended a modest flame and got on with their lives. Then there was mobility entirely foreign to European architecture. Once a cabin was built, it was chained to that plot of earth forever. If hunting grounds shifted or water sources dried, too bad. The house stayed, the family froze. The teepee, however, could be dismantled, transported, and reassembled in a new location, usually faster than a settler could replace a broken axe handle. The true contrast lies in how each structure responded to the environment. Settler houses fought nature and lost repeatedly. Teepees worked with nature and thrived. One wasn't just shelter. It was a system perfected for the plains. The other was a wooden box full of regrets. When you step back and consider all the elements, the aerodynamic cone, the buffalo hide insulation, the inner lining, the smoke flap ventilation, the warm floor system, the central hearth, the directional entrance, the portability, a clear picture emerges. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a masterpiece of human adaptation, quietly refined over generations through observation, testing, and deep ecological wisdom. Most buildings evolve by accidents. Someone builds a roof, it leaks, they adjust, and repeat until it stops collapsing. But the teepee didn't stumble into greatness. Every component was deliberate. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was overbuilt. Nothing required miracles to function in extreme cold. It was the opposite of trial and error. Architecture was trial and excellence. The genius lies in how all the pieces worked together. The shape supported airflow, the lining supported heating, the hides supported insulation, the poles supported portability, the entrance supported wind direction. Instead of forcing the environment to conform to human preference, a strategy that usually ends in rickety walls and disappointed settlers, the teepee cooperated with nature. It took what the plains offered and replied, "Yes, that works for us." This stands in stark contrast to the European approach of the time, which essentially boiled down to build box. Hope box survives. If box collapses, build another box nearby and repeat the same mistake. Meanwhile, the teepee demonstrated fluidity, adaptability, and efficiency centuries before those became engineering buzzwords. The teepee also thrived because it wasn't just a structure, it was woven into a way of life. It supported mobility, community, seasonal migration, hunting cycles, climatic shifts, and spiritual practices. A home wasn't merely a place to sleep. It enabled entire nations to move in rhythm with the land. When winter tightened its grip, the teepee didn't resist the cold, it outsmarted it. Even modern architects studying sustainable design often find themselves quietly impressed, though few will admit their most admired climate-responsive structure is centuries old and built without metal screws or concrete. But the truth is undeniable. The teepee remains one of the most efficient, portable dwellings ever engineered. In the end, the winter teepee didn't just keep people alive at -30. It allowed them to live well, warm, resilient, and in harmony with a landscape powerful enough to punish any flaw in design. That is the true beauty of the teepee: a humble shape, a simple frame, and a brilliance that still echoes through time. In the far north, winter never arrived quietly. It descended like a slow-moving beast, stealing minutes of daylight until the sun barely skimmed the horizon. For Viking communities across Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, these darkest weeks weren't just inconvenient, they were a test of endurance. Crops were long stored, the seas were treacherous, the world beyond the longhouse seemed frozen in time. This was the season of Yule festival, born not merely for celebration, but for the survival of the spirit. As the longest night approached, people faced it with equal parts dread and determination. The sun wasn't just hiding, it was weakening. Each shortened day hinted at a cosmic battle between light and the forces seeking to swallow it whole. The Vikings, though famously pragmatic, were deeply spiritual. They believed unseen powers governed the world's rhythms, and Yule gave them a way to influence that rhythm, or at least feel they could, through fire, feasting, sacrifice, and storytelling. They sought to call the sun back from the edge of oblivion. Preparations began weeks in advance. Families dried meat, secured livestock in warm enclosures, and selected animals for breeding or slaughter. One creature held special significance: the boar, robust, stubborn, and sacred to Freyr, the god of fertility, peace, and prosperity. Boar embodied everything the community longed for in winter's depths: strength, renewal, and the promise of spring. To sacrifice a boar at Yule was to symbolically feed the cycle of nature, an offering meant to coax the sun's rebirth. Inside the longhouse, anticipation grew. Fresh pine boughs decorated the pillars, their scent mingling with wood smoke. Children heard tales of ancient winters, heroic ancestors, and gods who battled frost giants to save the world. The central hearth became the heart of existence, not just radiating warmth, but hope. As long as the fire burned, so did the belief that light would return. At the heart of Yule stood the boar, sacrifice a ritual more sacred than any other. Freyr wasn't just a deity. He was the guarantor of the coming year's harvest, the quiet force behind warm summers and fertile fields. In winter's grip, honoring him was both reverence and necessity. The chosen Borophon, the finest an household could raise, was treated with profound respect. In some regions, it was groomed and adorned with wreaths, a symbolic acknowledgement of its role in sustaining the community. This was no mindless slaughter. It was a solemn exchange, life given so life might continue. Before the sacrifice, the boar was led before the clan. Each person laid a hand on its bristled back and swore a Yule oath, promises of bravery, intentions for the new year, vows to settle feuds once the snows melted, spoken in the presence of gods, ancestors, and kin. These oaths were binding. Breaking them brought dishonor and, worse, divine disfavor. Once the sacrifice was complete, the boar's blood was collected and sprinkled on carved idols, ceremonial stones, and even the people themselves. Our rite, called BLT, believed to strengthen the bond between mortals and the divine. The meat was roasted over an open fire, its rich aroma filling the longhouse, momentarily erasing the harshness outside. The feast that followed was communal. Every bite carried symbolic weight. To eat was to partake in Freyr's blessing, to share in the hope that fields would flourish and the sun regain its strength. Children were told the boar's spirit would race across the sky, guiding the returning light back to humanity. In this way, the sacrifice became more than ritual. It was a covenant, a promise that the Vikings would endure winter's darkness with resolve, and a plea that the gods reward their devotion with abundance in spring. If the boar sacrifice was Yule's sacred heart, mead was its golden lifeblood. To the Vikings, mead wasn't just a drink, it was a divine gift, a symbol of celebration, creativity, and communal strength. Brewed from honey, water, and often flavored with herbs or berries, it captured the stored sweetness of summer sunlight, transformed into liquid warmth. And there was no better time to release that warmth than in winter's frozen depths. Inside the longhouse, mead flowed freely. Massive drinking horns, carved with runes and serpentine patterns, passed hand to hand. Each person drank in turn, guided by ritual that reinforced solidarity. No one drank alone. A raised horn was an invitation to toast the gods, honor ancestors, or simply give thanks for surviving another year. The Vikings believed shared drink dissolved the walls hardship built. As the fire roared, the longhouse came alive. Shadows danced along timbered beams like spirits joining the gathering. Mead loosened tongues, thawed frozen hearts, and turned solemn sacrifice into joyous celebration. Warriors exaggerated old battles. Fishermen bragged of storms survived. Farmers predicted bountiful harvests with bold optimism. Laughter rose as night deepened, and for a few precious hours, winter's weight felt distant. But mead drinking wasn't mere indulgence, it was a ritualized release, a psychological shield against the season's crushing monotony. Each horn offered courage to endure the cold, face the unknown months ahead, and dare to hope for renewal. Even the skalds, the poets, and storytellers relied on mead for inspiration, believing it opened the mind to Odin's wisdom. Though revelry was expected, it wasn't chaotic. A designated host, the hall's leader, oversaw the passing of the horn, ensuring toasts maintained dignity and bonds were strengthened, not broken. Under this guidance, as mead loosened tongues and firelight softened the room, storytelling emerged as Yule's soul. To the Vikings, words were living forces capable of shaping memory, identity, and even destiny. They had no books or libraries. Their history survived because people spoke it aloud, year after year. The skalds, elite poets and keepers of law, commanded the room with presence equal to any warrior. They carried sagas in their minds as others carried blades, carefully, skillfully, with deep responsibility. During Yule, when darkness pressed close and the world felt uncertain, the skalds reminded everyone their ancestors had faced the same fears and survived. In a way, they provided psychological armor. Their tales ranged from epic to intimate. One moment, the Longhouse thundered with Thor's battle against giants. The next, it fell silent as stories of lost kin stirred quiet emotion. Children listened wide-eyed, absorbing everything like snow catching firelight. Adults nodded along, recognizing timeless themes: courage in winter, loyalty to kin, the fragile boundary between mortal and divine. Yet these stories weren't static relics. They evolved with each telling. A skald might adapt a tale to honor a local hero, comment on recent events, or gently tease someone in the room. This fluidity reveals a profound truth the Vikings understood. History isn't fixed. Tease a conversation between past and present, shaped by the needs of the living. Storytelling at Yule also served a deeper purpose. It reminded the community they belonged to something greater than themselves. In winter's isolation, sagas wove everyone into a shared mythic universe, reinforcing values, preserving memory, and kindling hope. Cultures with strong oral traditions often develop great resilience. They know how to turn fear into narrative, and narrative into strength. So as wind howled and snow piled against the walls, the Vikings sat wrapped in the warmth of words, believing, rightly, that stories could outshine even the darkest night. Though Yule brimmed with feasting and merriment, its core remained deeply spiritual. The Vikings saw winter not just as a season, but as a cosmic event, demanding recognition from both humans and gods. When the sun nearly vanished, they felt the weight of the cosmos in their bones. Central to Yule was the belief that the sun was struggling, that each shortening day signaled darkness, frost giants, and chaos gaining ground. The solstice rituals were attempts to help the sun reclaim its strength. Torches, bonfires, and hearth flames weren't just heat sources, they were symbolic beacons, earthly echoes of the celestial fire they prayed would return. Communities offered food, drink, and prayers to Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength against cold, and Freyr for fertile lands. Their spirituality blended practicality with myth. They prayed to the powers that controlled what they needed most: warmth, food, and clan safety. In a harsh world, faith wasn't a luxury, it was a survival strategy. On solstice night, the air grew electric. People watched the sky for omens, believing the veil between worlds thinned during Yule. Some expected ancestral spirits. Others imagined the gods riding the wild hunt, a stormy procession that could bless or terrify. And if you've ever stood in a northern winter storm, You understand why they heard supernatural riders in the wind. It feels otherworldly. When the solstice passed and daylight slowly lengthened, the mood shifted. The worst had passed. Light was returning. The offerings and rituals hadn't just honored the gods. They had sustained the community through winter's mental darkness. Yule, then, wasn't merely worship. It was a festival of resilience, reminder that even in the deepest night, renewal was already on its way. Beyond sacrifice and storytelling, Yule was also a time for simple human joy, games, gifts, and the strengthening of kinship. We often picture Vikings as grim warriors trudging through snowbutt during Yule. They allowed themselves playfulness, generosity, and sentiment. Once feasting settled into a warm hum, families turned to games, wrestling, board games like Hennefatov, strength contests, and humorous challenges meant to spark laughter when emotional warmth mattered as much as physical heat. Children darted around the hearth. Adults teased one another. Even elders joined in with quiet smiles. These moments of levity reveal more about Viking resilience than any saga of battle. They refused to let winter steal their humanity. Gift-giving was also part of the celebration, but unlike today's commercial extravagance, Viking gifts were practical. Carved toys for children, warm mittens, new tools, protective charms, or simple ornaments. Sometimes, a finely crafted knife or piece of jewelry changed hands, but meaning mattered more than value. Gifts symbolized appreciation, loyalty, and the reaffirmation of bonds essential to survival. This approach feels healthier, not about impressing, but about strengthening relationships. There was also the tradition of the alphabet, leaving food or drink for household spirits. Elves, or landvitar, believed to guard the home. Whether people truly expected invisible beings to partake or simply sought a gesture of gratitude, the practice fostered harmony between the human and unseen worlds. It reflected a deep truth. Survival was never achieved alone, not even by humans. In the end, Yule's games and gifts weren't minor distractions. They were emotional glue reminders that even in the harshest season, life held sweetness, humor, and companionship. In the darkest time, kinship became its own kind of light. Among all Yule's symbols, fire stood tallest, both literally and spiritually. The Vikings saw fire as more than heat. It was a living presence, a guardian against the creeping darkness of winter. And they were right. Anyone who sat beside a fire on a cold night knows its warmth lifts the spirit as much as the body. During Yule, households and communities lit great fires meant to echo the sun's rebirth. Torches were carried in processions, bonfires blazed on hilltops, and hearths burned continuously, each flame a defiant declaration. We are still here. Light endures. Processions filled the night, and hearths were fed with fresh logs. In some regions, a massive Yule logathon, an entire tree trunk, was burned continuously for days. Keeping the flame alive symbolized both endurance and continuity. If the fire survived the longest nights, so would the people. Personally, I love this symbolism. It transforms the simple act of staying warm into a collective declaration of hope. The Yule log itself carried layers of meaning. Some believed it shielded the home from misfortune. Others thought the sparks flying upward carried blessings to the gods. Families saved the ashes from the burnt log to scatter in their fields. trusting it would ensure fertile soil come spring. Even through a modern lens, there's something deeply beautiful about linking winter rituals to future harvests. It reveals how the Vikings wove every moment dark or bright into the unfolding cycle of life. Fire also marked the boundary between the ordinary and the sacred. As flames flickered against the longhouse walls, casting shifting shapes in the smoke, people believed the veil between worlds grew thinner. Ancestors might draw near, wandering spirits might linger, and the gods themselves might watch unseen from the glow. Honestly, on a long winter night filled with howling wind and cracking ice, it's easy to understand how the mind slips into that mystical space. Firelight has a way of making the world feel both smaller and larger at once. These fires, whether modest hearth flames or towering bonfires, represented the Viking attempt to answer darkness with light, not passively, but actively, almost defiantly. They couldn't control the sun's return, but they could create light of their own. And in many ways, that simple act is the essence of human resilience. When the world grows dark, we build a flame and choose to endure. While Yule was filled with warmth and celebration inside the longhouse, the world beyond was believed to be far more unpredictable. Winter nights carried mystery, and the Vikings felt the boundaries between the mortal and supernatural realms thinned during this season. One of the most dramatic beliefs tied to Yule was the wild hunter roaring, spectral procession said to sweep across the sky, led by none other than Odin himself. If you've ever stood outside during a violent winter storm, feeling the wind tear past you like galloping hooves, it's not hard to see where this idea came from. The wild hunt was a paradox, awe-inspiring, terrifying, and strangely comforting all at once. Odin, riding his 8-legged steed Sleipnir, was joined by slain warriors, restless spirits, and sometimes mythic beasts. To witness it was dangerous, to ignore it, foolish. People stayed indoors, whispering prayers, hoping the furious host would pass without taking someone along. I find this belief fascinating because it reflects how the Vikings interpreted nature. Storms weren't just weather, they were messages, warnings, or displays of divine power. But the wild hunt wasn't the only supernatural occurrence tied to Yule. Many Vikings believed ancestral spirits returned during this time, drawn to the warmth of the hearth and the offerings left in their honor. Families set aside food, drink, or even a spare seat near the fire. Whether these gestures were meant literally or symbolically, they emphasized the unbroken connection between the living and the dead, a reminder that identity stretched beyond a single lifetime. Some households also practiced rituals for house spirits, the Disir, or Landvader, believing that honoring them maintained harmony within the home. I personally love how balanced this worldview is. Instead of seeing spirits as threats, the Vikings often viewed them as partners, guardians of place, memory, and family fortune. Even the night sky became part of the mythic landscape. Strange lights, storms, and shifting clouds were interpreted as signs. The northern lights, now explained by science, were seen by many as reflections of Valkyries riding to battle. And, honestly, if you had no scientific explanation and saw the heavens ignite with shimmering green fire, imagining warrior maidens galloping across the sky would feel like a perfectly reasonable interpretation. In these beliefs, Yule became more than a seasonal festival. It became a cosmic drama reminder that humans were never truly alone in the winter dark. As winter slowly loosened its icy grip and days began stretching toward spring, the spirit of Yule lingered. For the Vikings, the festival wasn't just a moment of celebration, it was a philosophical statement about what it meant to endure. And honestly, I think this is why Yule still fascinates us today. It wasn't built around luxury or abundance. It was built around scarcity, resilience, and the simple human need to create light in dark times. What makes Yule especially compelling is how it evolved. After Christianity spread across Scandinavia, many pagan customs blended seamlessly into emerging Christmas traditions. The timing of the festival, the feasts, the fires, even the idea of gift-giving all found new homes within a Christian framework. But the old meanings didn't vanish. They hid beneath the surface, shaping the textures of winter celebrations across Northern Europe. I find this cultural blending beautiful. Instead of erasing the past, new traditions layered themselves on top, allowing people to carry forward both old and new identities. Take the Yule log, for example. Today, we think of it as a dessert or a decorative fireplace ritual, but its roots trace back to Viking households, feeding a massive wooden trunk into the hearth to keep the symbolic flame alive for days. Or consider the boar's head, once central to Freyr's sacrifice, now faintly echoed in medieval English feasting customs. Even the idea of gathering, drinking, storytelling, and reaffirming bonds during the darkest days of winter remains essentially unchanged. Humans still crave warmth and companionship when the world feels cold. The persistence of these traditions shows how deeply Yule resonated with the rhythms of human life. At its core, it was about hope, something every culture understands. The Vikings didn't celebrate because life was easy. They celebrated because life was hard. And in my opinion, that's the most powerful kind of celebration. It's defiant. It's emotional. It's a reminder that joy isn't the opposite of struggle. It's how people fight against it today. When we light candles, gather with loved ones, or tell old stories beside a winter fire, we're echoing impulses thousands of years old. We may no longer fear the sun will disappear forever, but the instinct to push back against darkness remains. And that, more than anything, is the lasting legacy of Yule, a festival that taught people not just to survive winter, but to transform it into something meaningful, communal, and profoundly human to most people standing outside the walls. A medieval castle looked like a place of calm, power-thick stone battlements, high towers, and a noble banner fluttering confidently above it all. But anyone who actually lived inside, especially the guards, knew the truth. A castle was not a peaceful sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker built for war, paranoia, and constant readiness. Honestly, I think castle guards had one of the most stressful jobs of the entire medieval world. You weren't just protecting a building, you were protecting a symbol of authority, wealth, and political pride. That meant you couldn't afford a single mistake. A guard's day began early, often before sunrise. While the castle kitchen stirred to life and craftsmen prepared their tools, guards were already checking gear, tightening straps, sharpening blades, and reporting for inspection. The castle constable or sergeant oversaw assignments. Who would patrol the courtyard? Who would watch the walls? Who would stand at the gatehouse? And who would be posted in the towers, Rotations mattered. Too much monotony caused fatigue. Too much excitement bred carelessness. In my opinion, it's impressive how well medieval commanders understood human behavior long before formal psychology existed. Inside the walls, a guard had to be both visible and alert. Every merchant, messenger, visitor, or wandering servant was a potential threat. Even residents weren't above suspicion. Guards watched for strange behavior at night prowling, or anyone lingering near restricted areas. More than one medieval plot unraveled because a sharp-eyed guard noticed something that just didn't look right. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing. Training drills occurred regularly. Archery practice, weapon handling, formation exercises, and emergency response to alarms. A guard never truly relaxed. He simply existed in varying degrees of readiness. Unlike knights, who rode into battle draped in honor and glory, guards were expected to do their jobs without fanfare. If everything went right, no one praised them. If anything went wrong, everyone blamed them. But the truth is, castles depended on these men far more than they depended on their knights. Guards were the ones who kept the peace, watched the gates, and maintained vigilance during the long stretches of quiet when danger felt distant but never disappeared. Their lives were a balance of routine, discipline, and the ever-present knowledge that even the calmest day could turn deadly in an instant. If the castle had a front line during peacetime, it was the gatehouse. This structure, often overlooked in movies, was the most strategically important choke point in the entire fortress. Every person, every cart, every animal, and every whisper of news passed through it. Honestly, I think gatehouse duty was both the most fascinating and most nerve-wracking assignment a guard could receive. You were the castle's filtered, deciding what entered its world and what stayed outside. The gatehouse was not just a doorway, it was an armored gauntlet. Guards stood on multiple levels, watching from arrow slits, tower windows, and parapets. Below them were murder-hole small openings in the ceiling that allowed defenders to drop boiling water, hot sand, or stones on intruders during an attack. And yes, despite modern myths, hot oil was rarely used. It was simply too expensive. Personally, I find this hilarious. Even in warfare, practicality trumped drama. At ground level, the main gate was reinforced with iron bands and backed by a heavy portcullis spiked metal grid that could slam down in seconds. The guard in charge of the winch had to be trusted completely. With one pull of a rope or release of a lever, he could allow entry, trap intruders, or seal the castle. The power and responsibility were enormous. Daily activity at the gatehouse was equally intense. As travelers arrived, guards asked questions. Who are you? Where are you from? What business do you have here? They inspected carts for hidden weapons, demanded written permission for entry, and watched anyone acting nervous or evasive. Smugglers, spies, disgruntled peasants, opportunistic thieves, anyone could be a threat. In my opinion, this level of social filtering would drive most modern people insane. But for medieval guards, it was simply part of the job. Tension always rose when nobles visited. Their entourages created traffic jams, horses reared, servants panicked, and everyone, including the guards, was expected to show flawless discipline. One slip, one insult, even an accidental delay could lead to punishment. The gatehouse was also where news arrived. first rumors of war, approaching envoys, outbreaks of plague, or sudden political drama. Guards learned bad news hours before the Lord did. In that sense, they were not just sentinels, they were the castle's early warning system for a guard. The gatehouse was a test of instinct, discipline, and courage. It was the castle's handshake with the outside world and, sometimes, its shield against it. Patrolling the castle walls was one of the most repetitive yet essential duties in a guard's life. Hour after hour, guards walked the battlement stone pathways along the top of the walls, keeping watch for threats both near and far. It might sound simple, but wall patrols required sharp eyes, steady nerves, and an almost unnatural tolerance for boredom. Personally, I think this job was designed to break anyone who wasn't mentally tough, too quiet, and you lost focus, too eventful, and you probably died. The patrol route usually started at one corner tower and wound around the entire perimeter. Along the way, guards checked arrow slits, leaned over crenellations to observe the countryside, and scanned roads, forests, and fields for movement. A single figure approaching the castle could be harmless or a scout for a much larger force. Every shape on the horizon had to be analyzed. Every sound mattered. A barking dog, distant smoke, a flicker of torchlight. Each detail could signal danger. Patrols happened in every kind of weather: blazing sun, freezing fog, sleet, rain, snow, and winds so strong they threatened to push a man right off the wall. And medieval walls offered no comfort. The stone was cold, the footing uneven, and the height terrifying for anyone with a hint of vertigo. I honestly admire the guards who managed to function up there without constantly imagining their own dramatic fall into the moat. But the physical challenge was only half the struggle. The mental strain was real. Hour-long patrols, repeated day after day, created a rhythm that lulled the senses. Guards had to fight the creeping numbness of routine. Missing a detail wasn't an option. Many castles introduced specific checkpoints or routine callouts to force guards to stay alert. A sergeant might appear unexpectedly to test a. Despite the monotony, patrols gave guards a unique understanding of the world beyond the castle. They knew the land, the traffic patterns, the weather shifts. They were the first to sense when something felt off, and in medieval times, instinct was half the job. A guard on patrol had to blend discipline with intuition, scanning a landscape where danger could gather silently just beyond the trees. In the end, wall patrols were the castle's heartbeat, constant, vigilant, and utterly essential. If day patrols were tedious, night watches were downright brutal. Once the sun dipped behind the hills and the castle surrendered to darkness, everything changed. The air grew colder, sounds traveled farther, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. In my opinion, this was the most psychologically demanding part of a guard's life. Humans simply aren't built for vigilance. In total darkness, yet medieval, guards were expected to perform flawlessly. Night watches were divided into shifts, often lasting 2 to 4 hours. The goal was simple: prevent exhaustion, but never let the castle go unobserved. Guards positioned themselves on walls, in towers, and at the gatehouse, each holding a lantern or standing near a brazier for warmth. Light was both a blessing and a curse. It helped guards see, but also made them visible targets. Many chose to stand half-hidden, letting their eyes adjust to the dark instead of relying on flickering flame. Sounds became the enemy. A loose stone falling, wind rustling through trees, a fox sneaking across the outer yard. Any noise could be interpreted as a threat, and honestly, I can't blame them. In an age of constant warfare and sudden raids, paranoia was a survival skill. A guard who dismissed something strange might doom the entire castle to stay awake. Guards used tricks, biting their tongues, pacing in circles, whispering prayers, or rhythmically tapping their weapons. Falling asleep on duty was one of the most serious offenses imaginable. In some places, the punishment was public humiliation. In others, execution. And while that sounds harsh, a single sleeping guard could invite catastrophe. Night also masked the approach of spies or saboteurs. Intruders often moved under moonlight, hoping to slip through unguarded postern gates or shadowy corners of the wall. Guards had to be aware not only of what was outside the castle, but also what was inside. Sometimes the greater danger came from betrayal servants, bribed to open doors, conspirators whispering in stairwells. I personally think this internal threat was even scarier. You could prepare for enemies outside, but you couldn't prepare for a friend suddenly turning traitor. Despite the fear, guards adapted, their senses sharpened, their instincts refined. Over time, night itself became a familiar companion, vast, silent battlefield they learned to navigate. And when dawn finally broke, painting the castle walls gold, every guard on duty felt a quiet triumph. Another night survived, another morning earned, in a world without electric lights, radios, or surveillance cameras. Medieval castles relied heavily on systems of identification, passwords, signals, and coded routines that told guards who belonged and who absolutely did not. Honestly, I think this is one of the cleverest and most underrated parts of castle security. People imagine medieval warfare as pure, brute strength, but the truth is, intelligence and subtlety were just as important. The nightly password, sometimes called the watchword, was essential. Every guard on duty learned it at the start of the evening, whispered from sergeant to soldier, always out of earshot of strangers. Anyone approaching after dark weather, a messenger, a patrolling guard, or even the castle lord himself had to know the password. If they didn't, spears came down, arrows were knocked, and negotiations became very uncomfortable very fast. I love how democratic this system was. Even a noble could be challenged by a low-ranking guard if protocol demanded it. But passwords weren't the only safeguard. Guards also used visual signals: a raised torch, a waved lantern, or a sequence of horn blasts to allow quick communication across walls and courtyards. A single horn might signal a returning patrol. 2 horns, unknown visitors. 3 horns usually meant trouble. The efficiency of this system always impresses me. Without technology, they still created reliable communication networks. There were also routines designed to expose imposters. Some castles required guards to walk specific paths at specific intervals. If a patrol didn't appear when expected, something was wrong. Others used command response phrases shouted across battlements. One guard would call out a line, and the next tower would respond with its matching phrase. This prevented attackers from quietly replacing or killing a watchman without detection. Inside the castle, servants and residents also needed ways to prove they belonged. Some wore tokens or badges. Others followed strict curfew rules. After dark, even familiar faces could be detained until verified. In my opinion, this level of caution shows how precarious medieval life really was. A moment of misplaced trust could bring down an entire fortress. These password systems weren't just bureaucratic rituals, they were life-saving tools. They prevented ambushes, stopped infiltrators, and empowered guards to challenge anyone, no matter their rank. In a time when disguise and deception were common tactics, the humble watchword might be the only thing standing between a quiet night and a deadly surprise. In short, passwords kept everyone alive and kept castles from becoming crime scenes. With good architecture, castle towers were more than dramatic architectural features. They were nerve centers of surveillance. Anyone stationed in a tower lived in a world of wind, height, and relentless observation. Honestly, I think tower guards had one of the toughest psychological roles. You weren't in the bustle of the courtyard or the warmth of the gatehouse. You were alone, waiting for something, anything, to move. Each tower offered a unique vantage point. From the highest levels, a lookout could see villages, forests, roads, and sometimes even the shimmer of a river miles away. This panoramic view made towers the castle's early warning system. A plume of smoke, a distant dust cloud, or the glint of metal in sunlight could all signal incoming trouble. The pressure was enormous. Imagine being the first person responsible for spotting an army before it reached your walls. Miss the signs, and the castle might have minutes, not hours, to prepare. Inside the tower, life was cramped. Stone walls trapped cold air, staircases spiraled tightly, and arrow slits allowed just enough space to see and shoot, but not enough to stay warm. Guards took turns warming their fingers near tiny braziers, trying not to lose mobility. Personally, I think frostbite was as much a threat as any siege weapon, but comfort was a luxury. Medieval guards weren't allowed. Archers stationed in towers had even more responsibility. Their bows were the castle's first line of active defense. From above, they could rain arrows on attackers long before melee. Troops reached the gate, but archers needed incredible skill. Shooting from height meant adjusting for wind, angle, and distance. A single miscalculation wasted precious ammunition, and in a siege, arrows were as valuable as food. Communication between towers was vital. Guards used horn blasts, shouted signals, or lantern flashes to relay what they saw. A suspicious figure near the tree line. Signal it. A caravan approaching. Signal it. Something strange in the village. Definitely signal it. Tower guards became experts at reading the landscape like a living map. Despite the solitude, there was a certain pride in tower duty. You were literally above everything, closer to the wind, the weather, and the first hints of danger. In my opinion, tower guards were the castle's eyes, and without them, every other defensive measure would crumble into chaos. Being in the tower meant vigilance, precision, and a constant awareness that the smallest detail could change everything. If towers were the castle's eyes, then murder holes were its teeth, small, unassuming, and absolutely lethal. These architectural features were built into gatehouses, passageways, and choke points, allowing defenders to unleash chaos on invaders trapped below. Honestly, I think murder holes are one of the best reminders that medieval architects weren't just builders. They were military strategists with surprisingly creative imaginations. A murder hole was usually a small square or circular opening in the ceiling above an entry passage. If attackers breached the outer gate or battered down a door, they'd rush inside often, cheering, thinking they'd won the first stage of the siege. Then they'd find themselves funneled into a narrow corridor, jammed together, and suddenly drenched in hot sand, stones, boiling water, or even quicklime. Personally, I think the use of hot sand is the most underrated tactic. It got into armor. Gaps stuck to sweaty skin and caused burns that lasted for weeks. These openings didn't appear by accident. Castle designers intentionally created killing zones, spaces engineered to trap attackers like insects in a bottle. The gatehouse was usually the worst of these. Defenders could fire arrows through slits, pour liquids from murder holes, and drop heavy objects from hidden ledges. The geometry was brilliant, narrow enough to bottleneck enemies, tall enough to create vertical attack angles, and winding enough to confuse anyone charging forward. Trap doors served a similar purpose. Some were simple wooden panels that could be pulled open to drop enemies into pits. Others were disguised beneath straw, dirt, or even decorative flooring. The goal wasn't always to kill it, was to separate, delay, or disorient attackers. What I personally love about these features is how psychological they were. Even skilled soldiers hesitated before entering a castle's inner passages. They'd glance upward, tap the floor with a spear, or hug the wall to avoid imaginary traps. The fear alone slowed an assault, significantly buying defenders precious time. Murder holes and trap doors weren't just gruesome, they were strategic masterpieces. They turned the castle itself into a weapon, allowing a handful of defenders to hold off dozens, even hundreds, of attackers. And in a world where manpower was limited and sieges brutal, that advantage could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In short, medieval castles didn't play fair. And that was exactly the point. While castle walls and towers protected against armies outside, many medieval lords feared something far sneakier: threats from within. A castle was a small, bustling ecosystem. Servants, cooks, blacksmiths, cleaners, knights, visiting nobles, wandering musicians, clergy, merchants, messengers, stable boys, and prisoners. That meant one terrifying truth: if someone inside wanted to sabotage the place, they had endless opportunities. Honestly, I think this internal danger was far scarier than any siege engine parked outside the gate. Guards were trained not only to watch for enemies in the forests, but also for suspicious behavior in the halls, a servant loitering where they shouldn't be, a scribe suddenly taking an interest in guard rotations, a visiting merchant asking too many questions. Even trusted retainers could be bribed by rival lords. Medieval politics, after all, was a web of shifting loyalties, secret pacts, and deadly rivalries, and a castle's greatest vulnerability was often its own people. Made modern office gossip look positively adorable in comparison. Because of this, guards patrolled the inside of castles just as rigorously as the outside. They monitored storerooms, checked locks, inspected the stables, and ensured that no one tampered with wells or food supplies. Poisoning was a very real fear. Some lords even employed dedicated food tasters, a role that, if you ask me, might have been the most stressful job in the entire Middle Ages. Then there were the prisoners. Many castles kept dungeons or holding cells deep within their foundations. Guards had to ensure no one passed contraband to captives, no bribes exchanged hands, and no sympathetic servant helped a prisoner escape. A single loose brick or a smuggled tool could spell disaster. Servants were both essential and risky. They had access to nearly every room, including the Lord's private quarters. Many were loyal, but loyalty could shift with hunger, fear, or a better offer. In my opinion, this is the part of medieval life we romanticize least, yet should understand most. Castles functioned because hundreds of people cooperated, yet any one of them could become a vulnerability. Information security was just as vital as physical security. Guards enforced strict rules about who could overhear council meetings, who handled correspondence, and who approached the Lord during rest hours. Even casual gossip could ignite rebellion if the wrong person heard it. Internal security wasn't glamorous. There were no epic battles, no heroic last stands, just constant vigilance and quiet suspicion. But without it, castles would have fallen far more often. Sometimes the deadliest enemy didn't need a siege tower, just a smile, a bribe, or a well-timed opportunity. And personally, I think that's the most unsettling truth of all. For all the architecture, weaponry, routines, and protocols, the true heart of castle security was the guards themselves, the men who lived every day on the edge of danger. Their world was built on discipline, instinct, and trust. And honestly, I think this human element gets overlooked far too often. Stone walls didn't protect a castle, people did. The walls were only as strong as the guards standing on them. Life as a castle guard meant accepting a strange balance. Long stretches of mind-numbing routine interrupted by moments of absolute terror. One day you were pacing the courtyard, bored out of your mind, watching chickens and listening to gossiping servants. The next, alarm horns blared, arrows flew, and every decision you made determined who lived and who died. That kind of emotional whiplash shaped guards into practical, sharp-witted survivors. Camaraderie was essential. Guards depended on each other the way sailors depend on their crew. You quickly learned who could stay calm under pressure, who had the sharpest eyes, who cracked jokes to ease tension, and who might panic in a crisis. In my opinion, this bond was one of the few things that made the job bearable. You weren't alone on the walls, you had brothers beside you. Training reflected this reality. Guards drilled, constantly practicing formations, rehearsing alarm responses, reviewing escape routes, and testing weapons. Some castles staged mock invasions to simulate surprise attacks. Others focused on communication drills, horn signals, torch patterns, shouted commands. The goal was simple. When chaos hit, no one hesitated, and no order was misunderstood. In an era without radios, clarity was everything. But beneath the discipline lay an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew the castle could be attacked at any moment before dawn, during a festival, while the Lord was away, or even in the middle of dinner. And not all threats came from armies. Fires, disease, outbreaks, famines, and political treachery could destabilize a castle from within just as effectively as battering rams from without. Personally, I think medieval guards lived in a constant state of controlled scanning, always listening, always preparing for the worst. Yet, despite the danger, they created stability in a world that rarely offered any. Their vigilance kept families safe, protected precious resources, and upheld the fragile order medieval society needed to survive. They weren't knights, they weren't celebrated heroes, but without them, castles were nothing more than ornate stone sculptures waiting to fall. In the end, castle guards lived on a razor's edge, but they held the line day after day, night after night, and that unshakable dedication is what truly kept the medieval world standing. Before the sun even cleared the rooftops of the Suburbarome's poorer districts, the streets were already alive. Wooden shutters slammed open. Vendors dragged carts onto uneven stone roads, and the lingering scent of yesterday's smoke clung to the morning air. For plebeians, laborers, porters, washerwomen, scribes, and freedmen, the market wasn't a luxury, it was where you bought your food for the day, because almost no one had storage space at home. And honestly, I think this alone tells you everything about daily Roman life. Survival was a daily negotiation. Bread sellers opened earliest. The moment their ovens released the first round loaves, customers crowded around, some still tying their tunics, others clutching a single bronze coin that decided whether they'd eat that morning. Beside them, fruit vendors arranged piles of figs, dates, and olives on rough wooden boards. Nothing was washed, nothing was polished. Rome didn't do presentation. If it was edible, someone would buy it. The noise built quickly. Boys shouted prices at the top of their lungs. Women haggled so fiercely it sounded like a quarrel. Animals bleated, snarled, or clucked, depending on which stall you passed. And woven into all this were pickpockets, small, agile, fearless. Personally, I think Roman markets trained thieves better than any criminal academy ever could. One moment you were admiring fresh grapes, the next your purse was gone. Water sellers wandered between stalls with sloshing buckets because street fountains weren't always safe. The city was vast, pipes leaked, and contamination was constant. Clean water was a gamble. Cheap wine, surprisingly, was often safer than water, which explains why so many Romans walked around slightly buzzed before noon. Every sense was assaulted. The clang of metal cups, the bark of vendors, the smell of frying fish or roasting nuts, the sting of smoke from charcoal braziers. Rome was never quiet, never still. But beneath the chaos was rhythm, the strange order only locals understood. Everyone had their preferred stall, their trusted seller, their daily routine. And for plebeians, the market was more than a place to shop. It was where news spread, gossip flourished, alliances formed, and life unfolded, one noisy morning at a time. In a city of 1,000,000 souls, the market was the beating heart, and it started pumping before the sun even thought about rising. If the open-air stalls were the lungs of the Roman market, the tabernae were its stomach, narrow, smoky, always packed, and always loud. These tiny street shops lined major roads and alleyways, each barely large enough for a counter, a few clay jars, and a very sweaty owner shouting over customers. Honestly, I think Rome invented fast food culture centuries before modern cities. They just replaced plastic wrappers with wooden bowls and swapped soda for cheap watered wine. Inside a taberna, you'd find food that was hot, simple, and filling. Lentil stew, grilled sausages, olives soaked in brine, fried fish, chickpea porridge, leftover meat simmering in wine sauce, or flatbread sprinkled with herbs. Most plebeians didn't have kitchens, no ovens, no space, sometimes not even a proper hearth, so street food wasn't a treat, it was survival. A day without a taberna meal usually meant a day without eating. The smell hit you first, from charcoal braziers mixed with garlic oil and the slightly worrying aroma of fish that probably should have been sold yesterday. Personally, I think Roman food safety standards would give modern health inspectors a heart attack. But Romans had strong stomachs, or at least they pretended to. The vinum, or cheap wine, was everywhere, served in clay cups from massive amphorae. It was almost always diluted, flavored with herbs, or sweetened with honey. Pure, undiluted wine was considered barbaric, something only Celts or drunkards would drink. Still, vinum was notorious for its low quality, often over-fermented or laced with questionable additives. But for a few coins, it warmed your chest and helped you forget you lived in a noisy tenement that might collapse at any moment. Honestly, who could blame them? Tabernae were social hubs, too. Laborers discussed wages. Gamblers argued over dice. Street philosophers preached loudly to anyone who didn't ask to be left alone. It was messy, crowded, and borderline unhygienic, but it was where life happened. Deals were made. Fights broke out. Friendships formed over steaming bowls of stew. And hovering in the background always were thieves. A distracted eater was easy prey, and crowded spaces made escape effortless. In the end, the taberna was more than a place to eat. It was where the city's pulse could be felt, tasted, and smelled. Rome may have ruled an empire, but it survived one bowl of street stew at a time. If you want to understand Roman street life, don't look at the buildings, look at the vendors. They were the true soundtrack of the city, shouting prices, praising their goods, insulting competitors, and doing everything short of physical combat to grab attention. Honestly, I think Roman vendors would put modern salespeople to shame. They had no microphones, no ads, no neon signs, just lungs powerful enough to terrify birds from trees. Every vendor had a strategy. Fish sellers bragged about freshness, even when the smell insisted otherwise. Fruit sellers stacked figs in precise pyramids because presentation did matter. Olive sellers let customers sample one or two, then guilt-tripped them into buying a whole bowl. Bakers flashed warm loaves like treasure, letting steam rise dramatically, and spice merchants. They were the tricksters of the market, boasting their pepper came from India when it probably came from a warehouse down the street. Prices were never fixed. Haggling was expected. A seller would start absurdly high. The customer would counter insultingly low, and the whole negotiation turned into theatrical performance. Passers-by watched for fun. Children placed bets. In Rome, buying food wasn't a transaction, it was entertainment, of course. Vendors weren't just loud, they were territorial. A newcomer setting up too close could spark a shouting match, or even a full-blown brawl with bread rolls as projectiles. Honestly, I'd pay to watch a Roman bakery fight. Many vendors were former slaves buying their freedom, or immigrants from the provinces, trying to make a living in the empire's busiest city. Their stalls reflected their roots. Greeks sold honey cakes, Syrians offered sesame treats, Egyptians prepared spiced beans. Rome was chaotic, but also surprisingly cosmopolitan. In a single street, you could taste half the Mediterranean world, but beneath the colors and noise was desperation. Vendors had to sell enough each day to survive tomorrow. There were no safety nets, no guaranteed wages. Illness meant no income. Bad weather meant hungry children. Rome's glamour rested on the backs of people who hustled from dawn to dusk, praying they sold enough olives, wine, or fish before the day turned sour. Yet, despite the struggle, vendors kept the city fed. Without them, Rome's million residents simply couldn't function. Markets weren't just places of commerce, they were lifelines, and the vendors were the ones holding the city together, one shouted sale at a time. If you walked through a Roman market at midday, your stomach made decisions before your brain did. The smell of sizzling meat, frying dough, and spiced chickpeas filled the air so thickly that even the gods on Olympus might feel jealous. Rome ran on street food not because people loved convenience, but because most had no kitchens. And honestly, I think the Romans perfected grab-and-go millennia before it became a trend. Vendors cooked on portable braziers, sending curls of smoke into hot, dusty streets. The most popular meals were simple but flavorful: grilled sausages, wrapped in bread, lentil stews, barley porridge, fried fish, stuffed dates coated in honey, roasted nuts. Romans weren't picky. If it filled your stomach and didn't poison you, it was good enough. One of the biggest crowd pleasers was thermopolium food, the ancient equivalent of a fast food counter. These shops had stone counters with embedded jars filled with hot dishes kept warm by coals underneath. You'd walk up, point at something bubbling, and a ladleful ended up in your bowl. Personally, I think they deserve far more credit. They were basically the ancestors of every modern food stall, diner, and street cart rolled into one. And then there was wine, cheap, sour, often watered down and flavored with herbs. A cup cost barely anything, which is why half the city spent afternoons slightly tipsy. But given how stressful Roman street life was, I can't blame them. Of course, with every good thing came danger. Food wasn't regulated. Vendors reused oil until it turned black. Fish sat in the sun longer than any reasonable person would tolerate. Meat skewers were sometimes more bone than meat. I'm convinced that surviving Roman cuisine required a digestive system forged in fire. The truly unlucky got sick. The truly experienced just shrugged and kept eating. But the real charm of Roman street food wasn't the taste, it was the atmosphere. Crowds jostled. Cooks shouted orders. Children begged for scraps. Musicians played for coins. And the aroma of spices like cumin and coriander drifted through the chaos. Food connected everyone: slaves, freedmen, citizens, foreigners, beggars, soldiers, merchants. In a world where life was unpredictable and often harsh, street food provided something consistent, comforting, and communal. It gave flavor to the struggle of daily life and kept the city alive, one sizzling skewer at a time. If the Roman Forum was the political brain of the empire, then the street markets were its beating, chaotic heart. To walk through one was to surrender your senses completely. Sight, sound, smell, all overwhelmed at once. Honestly, I think a time traveler would last about 5 minutes before begging for earplugs and fresh air. The noise came first. Vendors yelling prices, bakers shouting their bread was still warm, fishmongers screaming their catch was fresh from Ostia, even though everyone knew half the fish had spent the night in a bucket of questionable water. Add in children laughing or crying, donkeys braying, dogs barking, and the occasional drunk rambling about politics, and you had a soundscape that made modern city traffic seem peaceful. Then came the crowds. People didn't walk in straight lines. They flowed like water in unpredictable currents. One moment you were squeezed between two women balancing baskets on their heads. The next, a legionary cut straight through the street as if he owned the place, and to be fair, Romans sort of believed soldiers did. Personally, I think navigating Roman markets deserves recognition as an Olympic sport. Dodging carts, stepping over spilled olives, avoiding loose chickens. Your reflexes had to be sharp. Smells layered themselves like a complex perfume gone horribly wrong. Fresh fruit mixed with rotting scraps, hot stew with animal manure, sweat with incense sold by traveling Syrians. Rome smelled like life, death, food, labor, and ambition blended into one unforgettable aroma. In a strange way, I admire it. Romans didn't strive for sterility. They embraced the mess because it was honest, and within the chaos came moments of pure theater. An argument over figs could escalate into a street-wide shouting match. A random musician might debut a new instrument. A storyteller would gather a crowd with tales of heroes only to be drowned out by a passing cart full of amphorae. Every second, something new happened. But beneath the overwhelming noise and commotion, the market had a rhythm, most like a living creature. People depended on this chaos to survive. It fed them, employed them, entertained them, connected them. Yes, Roman markets were loud, filthy, and exhausting, but they were also vibrant, social, and full of human energy. And in my opinion, they were the closest thing the ancient world had to a city's soul. Raw, unfiltered, and alive. If the Roman street market was a living creature, then thieves were the parasites, clinging to its skin, persistent, clever, and impossible to eliminate. Petty crime wasn't a side effect of market life, it was built into it. With thousands of bodies pressed together and coin purses dangling from belts, the place was a paradise for pickpockets. And honestly, I think Roman thieves deserved a degree in criminal innovations. Some of their methods were disturbingly impressive. The most common thieves were just small, underestimated. They slipped through crowds like fish in water. A bump on the elbow, a tug on the sleeve, a fake stumble in. Suddenly your purse was halfway across the street. Older thieves worked in coordinated teams. One distracted you with conversation, another blocked your view, and a third plucked the goods. It was organized chaos and, in my opinion, modern scammers would admire the efficiency. Market guards existed, of course. They strolled around with clubs, glaring suspiciously at anyone who looked too alert or too relaxed. But guards couldn't be everywhere. Rome was enormous, and crime moved faster than authority ever could. Some victims shouted, "Thief!" But by the time the crowd reacted, the culprit was long gone, vanished into a maze of alleys and stairwells. Vendors themselves weren't innocent either. Some cheated with rigged scales, hollowed out weights, or dampened grain that cost more by the pound. A fishmonger might sprinkle water on old fish to make. The most common thieves were children, fast, small, underestimated. They slipped through crowds like fish in water. A bump on the elbow, a tug on the sleeve, a fake stumble in, suddenly your purse was halfway across the street. Older thieves worked in coordinated teams. One distracted you with conversation, another blocked your view, and a third plucked the goods. It was organized chaos and, in my opinion, modern scammers would admire the efficiency. Market guards existed, of course. They strolled around with clubs, glaring suspiciously at anyone who looked too alert or too relaxed. But guards couldn't be everywhere. Rome was enormous, and crime moved faster than authority ever could. Some victims shouted, "Thief!" but by the time the crowd reacted, the culprit was long gone, vanished into a maze of alleys and stairwells. Vendors themselves weren't innocent either. Some cheated with rigged scales, hollowed out weights, or dampened grain that cost more by the pound. A fishmonger might sprinkle water on old fish to make them shine. A fruit seller might bury rotten figs under a layer of fresh ones. Personally, I find this darkly amusing. Everyone was trying to survive, even if it meant bending a few ethical lines. But thieves didn't just steal goods, they stole opportunities. A hungry family might lose their dinner money in an instant. A laborer might lose a week's wages before he even reached home. Crime wasn't just annoying, it was devastating. And yet there was a strange acceptance about it. Romans understood that a crowded city bred competition not only for food and work, but also for luck, comfort, and security. Some people fought back. Merchants hired guards. Shoppers kept coins hidden under tunics or in sandals. Parents warned children to stay close, but the market was too big, too alive, too unpredictable to ever be truly safe. And maybe that's what made it irresistible. In the Roman street market, every step was a gamble. You could walk away with a basket full of food door, missing half the money you walked in with. Danger and necessity danced together in every crowded street. If you ever dream of stepping into ancient Rome, let me give you a gentle reality check. The city did not smell like marble temples and clean linen. It smelled like humanity, pungent, overwhelming humanity. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the street markets. Personally, I think modern people romanticize Rome far too much. Drop them into a real Roman market for 5 minutes, and half would faint. The other half would sprint back to the time machine. Let's start with the streets themselves. Rome had hundreds of thousands of residents, but no garbage trucks, no sewer grates, no citywide cleaning schedule. Waste piled up in corners, food scraps rotted on stone. Stray animals wandered, contributing their own gifts. Add spilled wine, fish guts, urine, yes, public urination was completely normal. And smoke from 1,000 charcoal braziers, and the air became a swirling cloud of smells, both delicious and horrifying. The noise wasn't any gentler. People shouted constantly, not out of anger, but because you simply couldn't hear otherwise. Vendors hollered prices. Children screamed while playing tag. Carts rattled over stones. Dogs barked. The occasional rooster crowed for no reason. And since Rome had no noise regulations whatsoever, the market was a sound explosion from dawn to dusk. Honestly, I think Romans developed superior lungs and thicker patience just by living there. And then there was the filth underfoot, sludge formed where water runoff mixed with organic waste. Sandals slipped, tunics got dirty. You had to watch where you stepped in. Even then, you'd probably step in something questionable. Public slaves sometimes swept, but only when someone complained loudly enough. Otherwise, Rome relied on sun, time, and sheer optimism to deal with its mess. Yet here's the strange part: people loved the markets anyway. The smells and noise were part of Roman life's rhythm. They meant the city was alive, not dying. They meant trade was moving, fires were burning, pots were cooking, animals were living. To Romans, discomfort was simply the price of civilization. From a modern perspective, it sounds chaotic, maybe even unbearable. But from a Roman perspective, this was the pulse of the empire, filthy, loud, crowded, and full of opportunity. In its own messy way, the market's filth was a reminder of Rome's greatest paradox. The world's most powerful empire was built on streets that smelled like yesterday's fish stew and donkey dung. For all its chaos, filth, and noise, the Roman street market wasn't just a place to buy figs or haggle over olives. It was the empire's unofficial social network. If a plebeian wanted to know who got elected, exiled, divorced, died, or embarrassed themselves at last night's dinner party, they didn't read a newspaper, they went to the market. And honestly, I think the market functioned better than half the political institutions Rome ever created. Every morning, gossip flowed faster than wine at a banquet. Women gathered around fruit stalls to trade rumors about neighbors. Men waiting for bread updated each other on Senate debates, usually exaggerated beyond recognition. Retired soldiers boasted loudly about battles they never fought. Slave dealers and tradesmen overheard everything and repeated it twice as loudly. Rome didn't just spread news, it performed it. Politics seeped into conversations, whether you liked it or not. Supporters of rival candidates argued over grain prices, taxation, military campaigns, and which politician was secretly sleeping with whose wife. These debates could get heated, sometimes too heated. Fistfights in the middle of the market were treated like spontaneous entertainment. Personally, I think Romans invented political commentary by accident. Half their arguments sound exactly like modern online comment sections. But the market wasn't only about drama. It was also where relationships formed. Fishermen sold regularly to the same tavern keepers. Olive farmers recognized loyal customers. Freedmen worked to find jobs. Mothers arranged marriages or made alliances. The market stitched the community together in a way temples and government buildings never could. Performers also flocked here. Jugglers, flute players, storytellers, snake handlers, even amateur philosophers using crowds to earn coins or attention. Kids followed them, half amazed, half terrified. If someone made a witty joke or played a clever tune, word traveled fast. Fame in Rome didn't come from social media. It came from being loud, creative, and standing in the right part of the market at the right time. And then there were the fortune tellers. They read omens from birds or tossed pebbles in patterns, predicting fortunes for anyone willing to pay a few coins. Personally, I think they were masters of improvisation. No matter what you asked, they had a mystical-sounding answer ready in the end. The market wasn't just where Romans bought food, it was where they lived socially. It was a theater of human behavior, a political battleground, a rumor factory, and a community center disguised as chaos. For the average Roman, it wasn't optional, it was essential at the end of the day. The Roman street market was more than noise, filth, food, gossip, and thieves. It was a battlefield for survival. Every plebeian who stepped into that crowded maze faced a simple truth. If you didn't fight for your place in the market, you didn't eat. And honestly, I think this relentless daily struggle shaped Roman identity far more than their grand marble monuments ever did. Plebeians lived on razor-thin margins. Most earned wages by the day, not the week, which meant every morning began with uncertainty. A bad day at work meant a thin dinner. A missed day meant no dinner at all. The market was where this economic reality became painfully obvious. You bought only what you could afford, usually enough for a single meal. Food was never taken for granted. It was earned. People learned to stretch their coins as creatively as possible. Older vegetables sold cheaper in the afternoon. Fishmongers lowered prices before closing to avoid waste. Bakers offered yesterday's bread at a discount. Watching Romans navigate these choices feels incredibly familiar, like seeing ancient roots of modern paycheck-to-paycheck living. Personally, I find it strangely comforting to see how ancient people dealt with the same struggles we do, making budgets, hunting bargains, hoping today's money lasts until tomorrow. The market also reflected social inequality with painful honesty. Wealthy Romans rarely set foot here. They sent slaves instead. Meanwhile, the poor walked through the crowds themselves, bargaining fiercely for every coin. A patrician might never know the smell of rotten fruit underfoot, but a plebeian knew it intimately. They lived close to the ground, literally and figuratively. But despite the hardship, the market was full of resilience. You saw it in the baker, who laughed through exhaustion, the widow who haggled fearlessly, the fisherman who arrived before dawn, hoping for a decent sale. You saw it in the kids who ran barefoot between stalls, turning poverty into play. Rome liked to brag about its military victories, but, in my opinion, its real triumph was the endurance of ordinary people who carved out a life in a city that rarely made things easy. As the day wound down, stalls closed, leftovers were swept into gutters, and the smell of charcoal faded from the air. The market grew quiet, but only until dawn. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The shouting, the bargaining, the cooking, the stealing, the surviving. Rome didn't run on emperors or senators. It ran on these everyday struggles. And in the chaotic heartbeat of the street market, you can still hear the spirit of the empire's millions, stubborn, hungry, resilient.